It's sad living in America. It's sad. Anyways, hey guys, what's up, the Culture Detective here, investigating your favorite albums, and today I'm going to be doing an album review on the new Mount Eerie album. I've been busy over the last week, and I wasn't in the mood in the last couple of days to review this album. So I finally have some time to talk about this album today. I have to talk about this album. I was really anticipating this album the moment he announced that this album is coming out. So, Mount Eerie Night Palace. So, singer, songwriter, producer Phil Elverum, aka The Microphones, aka Mount Eerie, is back with a new album. A few years ago, I reviewed one of my favorite albums of all time, and that album is The Glow Part 2 by The Microphones, aka Phil Elverum, aka Mount Eerie. The Microphones The Glow Part 2 is honestly one of the most crushing, existential, cold, melancholic, yet genuinely beautiful albums I've ever heard. Every time I listen to The Glow Part 2, both the song and the album, I feel like I'm vomiting my guts out and crying and screaming. Tracks like The Moon and Maps are essential to my sadness, and it's incredibly just life-changing album for me. And a little bit later in the mid-2000s, I believe, The Microphones released the album Mount Eerie, which then sort of goes into a tangent, and The Microphones has become Mount Eerie itself. Now, in 2017, I have made my first contact with his music with the album A Crow Looked at Me, and it is a terrible way to start off my journey listening to his music, because A Crow Looked at Me is his most depressing and probably one of the most depressing albums of all times. It is about death, because at the time of making A Crow Looked at Me, Phil Elverum's wife passed away due to cancer. And so A Crow Looked at Me is an album about that, and calling it a depressing experience feels like I'm underselling it, because this album presents death as it is. It's not some overdramatic, sad album about death. It is just about the end of a life. And when I listened to it in 2017, I could feel how sad and how heartbreaking it is. But honestly, I've never listened to the album since then. I'm afraid to. But because of Night Palace, I revisited A Crow Looked at Me a little bit, and by track 2, I couldn't fucking handle it. And I feel like the more I age in life, the harder is it for me to handle something like this. Because now people mean different things. People are real and they're meaningful. And the more I know people, the more meaningful people are. And it's just a really tough album to swallow. Immediately the year after, he released Now Only, which I don't think is recorded before. I don't think Now Only is recorded after A Crow Looked at Me. I feel like it is something that's simultaneously happening a few years ago. And then in 2020, we have the album The Microphones in 2020, where he released one more album under the name of The Microphones. And this album is essentially one song, but the song is 44 minutes long. And essentially him and his guitar singing about his life, singing about his early life and how his music career came to be. And it's basically a diary in musical form. Oh my god, he's literally me. Holy shit, he's literally me, because I point my phone to myself and film myself talk about my life for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and I never stop. He's literally me. Anyways, all this prologue builds up to Night Palace, his new album, and he's also touring. 2 weeks later, he's coming to LA to perform, and I am, you know, So anyways, Night Palace is 26 tracks long, and it's 1 hour and 21 minutes long. This is his most maximalist album, his most ambitious project since The Glow Part 2, which is, by the way, over 2 decades ago. And yeah, this album is very all over the place. He tries everything from folk to rock. He even dabbles into electronic music on this album. And it is very crazy. It's very loose, it's very lo-fi, and new listeners may be turned off by how messy and loose and all over the place this album is. But that's exactly where Phil Elverum's genius lies, is that if you package your music and make it very neatly tied together and very beautifully arranged, it's artifice. The way the music he makes is lo-fi, loose. He expresses himself in his full capacity because now the artifice of arranging music is not getting in his way. This is the appeal of slacker rock and lo-fi folk music to begin with. And lyrically, he also touches on many lyrics that he always touches on: existence, death, life, love, parenthood, even politics on this album. He talks about many things on this album, but he talks about them in a new perspective, in a new, mature perspective that is also at the same time extremely poetic and beautiful. And yeah, this album is heavy, it's sad, it's melancholic, but also this is probably his funniest album to date. There are a lot of weird, funny, quirky moments that you would never expect from a Mount Eerie album. So obviously Night Palace, despite the fact that we are already over 2 decades into the man's discography, we are still getting something so refreshing, so out there, so wild. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to go over all of the tracks on this album one by one. Buckle your seatbelts. We have the title track, which is the album opener, Night Palace. And also, I would like to mention that this album in vinyl form, it's 2 vinyls, and each vinyl has 2 sides. So this album has 4 sides, and each side is like a different chapter of its own. The first chapter is easily the most experimental chapter, which is very interesting placement. That all the most experimental and noisy stuff are placed in the first quarter of this album. And the second quarter is more narrative heavy, and it's more beautiful and soft and folky. The third quarter of the album is basically political rock music, and the last quarter is the most poetic and surreal. So anyways, we are in the extremely noisy, experimental, drony first chapter of the album, starting off with 4 minutes of distorted drony guitars, sparse percussions that's about 20 seconds apart from each other, very vulnerable vocals coming from Phil Elverum as expected, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the album. But I just love this introduction to the album. It's harrowing in terms of how noisy and crushing it is, but then we have lyrics like, "I'm in love with the last of the light, however long I have left in life, and so what if no one ever finds this notebook?" This album is basically a notebook. It's a bunch of random jotted down notes, bits and pieces of Phil's thoughts in musical form. That's why it's so all over the place, it's so messy, yet there's something so fucking genuine and honest and heart-wrenching about all this that makes it so compelling. We have the track High Fire, which is a straightforward slacker rock track with folky soft chords, swirling drums, chilled bass line, and a great follow-up. Following that, Breaths is pure drone and white noise and pounding drums, but then the second half sees the noise kind of melt down and Phil's vocal sort of creep up from behind. That's really beautiful. The first 3 tracks also talk about something very existential: Phil's relationship with nature, him seeing lightning in the sky, and how that reminds him of aging and his existence and the sort of feebleness of his existence. Following that, we have Swallowed Alive, which is 52 seconds of harsh screaming and sporadic drums. Holy shit, the microphones is so back. And we have his daughter talking about being swallowed alive by a lion. And even though this track is a bit of a joke track, it's a bit of a family moment, it still perfectly fits into the microphone's aesthetics. Then we have My Canopy, a 58-second long guitar ballad where Phil Elverum movingly sings to his daughter, "But my love for you, my child, is as permanent as sky. Breathe forever beneath the canopy of my life." Holy shit, that's fucking beautiful. Then the chapter ends off with Broom of Wind, and it is instrumentally a laid back and beautiful song, very relaxing, very low key, and he sings about sweeping with an old broom, living his daily life, but then these lyrics sort of change into his meditations on aging and his life getting worn down like the old broom that he's using right now, and it is as painful and as morbid as it can get. So wow, what a crazy way to end off part one. And then entering part two, we have I Walk, which is the most beautiful track here, and also one of the most beautiful tracks to be released all year. It starts off with soft rain sounds, and it builds up to gently shimmery guitars, tender drum machines, which I didn't expect from Mount Eerie. He's doing a little bit of Sufjan Stevens here. It's melancholic, it's warm and lovely, and the second half of the track turns into a driving rock song. And again, lyrically, he just sings about his past, his artistry, and we are getting into this late era Phil Elverum where he begins to really think and write songs about aging and life and death. And we have lyrics: "Since all time trailing behind me, back into the mist, I walk until it's all fallen away, coming into a clearing, there's a pause between the breaths, and I look up." We have Soft Air, which is a 1-minute outro for the previous track. The wind sounds continue, and Phil Elverum sings about how the wind sort of blows into his lungs, and the moment the wind blows into his lungs, we are hit with these thick, dense, drony guitars. We have Empty Paper Towel Roll, which is a 90-second long rocker about looking at the sky through a empty paper roll, and this is his idea of bottomlessness, which is kind of cheeky and kind of sad. Wind and Fog parts 1 and 2 have pulsating drony guitars that explode into harsh noise. Lyrically, this song is a love letter to wind and fog, the nature. The second half of this track borders on ambient with its low register vocals, pumping beats, and strums of guitars. Both parts are instrumentally very different from each other, so flow-wise it didn't go over that well, but nonetheless, love letters to nature is Phil Elverum's thing, and I absolutely love it. Blurred World has the dreary, numbing guitars, backup vocals, and it's beautiful, but it's also the least memorable part of the entire album. In my opinion, it is the weakest point of the album. Then we have 3 tracks on the album that I would like to call the Animal Trilogy. That is, I Heard Whales, I Think, I Saw Another Bird, and I Spoke with a Fish. And these 3 tracks are very compelling, gorgeous folk tracks, with pianos being introduced in I Heard Whales, I Think, and a giant chunk of pure white noise in the middle of the track. It's absolutely fantastic that he's doing way more experimentation on this album than ever before, after the Glow Part 2 anyways, and lyrically he talks about how he thought he heard the sounds of a whale. And then on I Saw Another Bird, the story goes, a bird is trying to catch the main character's attention, even though the main character is completely hopeless and empty because the world is falling apart. That is attached to simple 4/4 drums, distorted guitars, and a moving, noisy climax. But the craziest moment on the entire album is I Spoke with a Fish, which is the weirdest anomaly on the entire album. I told a fish, what you see as a palace is running water. Whatever the fuck that means. It's beautiful. The fish said, no, what you see as those mountains is flowing matter. I said, okay. There's something so Taoist about this. And it teeters between the line of cartoonish and funny, but also profoundly philosophical. And when the fish said its line, the song suddenly turns into trap beats and auto tunes. And one might think that Phil Elverum is making fun of modern music, but he does this so tastefully that honestly it's amazing. Honestly, it's brittle, it's surreal, yet it just perfectly, it's ingenious. And the rest of the song is beautiful with layered vocals, bellowing horns. I feel like I'm beside the ocean in some old seaside town. And there is a Big Lebowski reference at the end of the track, which is, again, the lyrics on the song and the album teeters on being funny and cheeky and being philosophical. Then we have the ending track for Chapter 2, Myths Come True, with these surreal, scratchy, alien tones and a groovy bass line and cool cymbals and hi-hats on top of some spoken word about spotting an abandoned FedEx truck on a rainy day. Very visual storytelling here on top of something so new and urban. What the fuck? Then we have the third chapter of the album where it gets really political, which is amazing to hear. We have non-metaphorical decolonization, and the chord progression on this track is blissful, summery, dare I say, shoegazy. Some soft organ-like keyboards gets introduced in the second half, and Phil Elverum sings about America and how people think of America in the olden days and now. The track November Rain sees Phil Elverum talking about capitalism and wealth, rich people snugly enjoying their lives in their very beautiful homes. And instrumentally, it's exciting, it's passionate. It really reminds me of Fleet Foxes, but it's at the end of the day, it is a Phil Elverum track. Co-owner of Trees is about land ownership and nature, and it is a 6-minute explosive rock track. It's repetitive and drony, and it's very Swans-esque because of that. And Myths Come True Part 2 has these guitars that sounds like hammered dulcimer. Maybe they are hammered dulcimers, I don't know, but the windy instrumentation really, it's just so freaking nice. And Sun is an angry rock track, less than 2 minutes. Is very Jeff Rosenstock-esque, but again, Phil Elverum puts his own spin to it. There's something so vulnerable about this track. He sings about his past collapsing and being irrelevant. And then Writing Poems is noisy on the first half and then trails off in the second half. He meditates on his writing process and the pointlessness of art in general. He writes these songs and nobody listens to them, and what's the point of anything, really? And then we have the Gleam Part 3, which is the long-awaited third installment of the Gleam, which are a couple of tracks dating from well over 2 decades ago, and he's bringing it back with the cold, sour guitars and these drum and guitar hits. Every hit is like my heart sinking bit by bit by bit. And once again, lyrically, he sings about existence and aging. Then we enter the last part of the album. Stone Woman gives birth to a child at night. And this is the most serious section on the entire album, but also at the same time, instrumentally, this track is fucking whack. We have these pulsating keys at the back, and then 1 minute into the track, we are introduced to these messy, fluttery hi-hats. It's so chaotic, and lyrically, it's so dejected at the same time. To follow that up, we have a 12-minute long spoken word masterpiece called Demolition with wind noises in the back. And spoken word is very rare in his music, and he talks about his past, his art, his house, his parenthood, nature, and also his experience in a meditation retreat. Then the album ends off with I Need New Eyes, which is a very powerful ending to the album. I feel like musically this is an accumulation of everything on this album, but also his career with distorted thick guitars, soft drum machines, background hums. And most interesting thing about this track is that it is not much of a conclusion, more so a plot twist, where Phil Elverum basically refuses his older ideology on impermanence, which is, we're getting a little Buddhist here, and impermanence is the idea that things start and they end, everything starts and ends, and everything keeps changing. But he has a new idea with the lyrics, but now a new idea complicates my old age. It's that nothing arises in the first place. All this impermanence is just another thing my mind made. I was never here, and nothing goes away. And later on in the track, we have the constant catastrophes pound on the wall, and who isn't my neighbor on this flaming globe? That is this, Very interesting stuff. We have Phil Elverum talking about how instead of thinking of things as starting and ending constantly, maybe all of life is just one great continuum that doesn't really change. Or even if there's change, it's still just one great continuum. And thus thus the track title, I Need New Eyes. And it is as mature and as beautiful and as hopeful and thought-provoking as an album ending can get, especially from Mount Eerie. And honestly, not only is this one of the most ambitious and interesting and maximalist projects to come out this year, but it's also so poetic and beautiful and melancholic, and it is something that I've been really excited for, and this album delivered. And yes, the tracks on this album are a bit all over the place, it's a bit loose, it's a bit messy at times, and I do have to admit that this isn't the best project he's ever put out. The Glow Part 2 is still the best project simply because of how emotionally resonant that album is, but nonetheless, this is a masterpiece, and feeling a strong 9 on this thing. Maybe even a 10. I wouldn't be surprised, man. If I listen to this album a few more times, maybe it's going to turn into a 10. But right now, I'm just going to put it at strong 9. And, yeah. So, have you listened to the new Mount Eerie album? Comments below. Let me know. Subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching. Reviewing The Cure tomorrow.